over 1 million galaxies, which had never been seen before by any other humans. So you can see why people really like this kind of idea. You know, they're looking at galaxies that have never been seen before. And what this idea really does is it changes the definition of who can be involved in a project, and it changes the very definition of what a scientist is and what a scientist can do to contribute towards this. Okay, so the good news about this. This is a largely untapped resource, so it could be exploited to much greater potential than it is being now. It's very good for outreach and getting the public involved instead of alienating them, which is what can happen in some areas of science. The public can feel very much like they don't understand what's going on, and there are experts who do this, and they don't want anything to do with it. It's not interesting to them. So this is actually getting them to become more involved in science and find science more interesting because there's some way in which they can contribute to it. It also creates entirely new fields of science. So, for example, one thing that Michael Nielsen talked about was the idea of tracking climate change by people sending data in through their iPhones or whatever about how populations of birds have changed in certain areas. So that can give you an idea of how the climate is changing, and there are lots of other ways in which you can do this. So again, this means that the expert attention, the people who are trained and have PhDs in these areas, can then be refocused to really working out the hardest parts of the problem, while problems like this can be crowdsourced to the public. There are actually an increasing number of consumers of science, and by this I mean the general public who find science interesting, who read science magazines and read a lot of stuff online about science, but at the moment they have no way of putting something back into the community. And I think that developing techniques like this can actually help people put something back into something which they're very enthusiastic and passionate about. So that's the good news. The bad news. Bad news always. Okay, scientists aren't actually taking very much advantage of either of these methods. And the reason for this is that academics are not very good early adopters. So what you tend to find is that academics are interested in doing research in a very narrow field and publishing that research in peer-reviewed journals. And you'd be surprised how much this is the one view of what academics do. So scientists who do contribute to projects like this tend to take a blow to their reputation because, okay, blogging and using online tools as part of your everyday work is not really considered very scientific at the moment. And I argue that it should be. And this is due to the way in which the academics are rewarded, which is what I mentioned earlier, is by publication in peer-reviewed journals. And there's no easy way to get to this at the moment using these online tools. So what we really need is some way to use the online tools to generate peer-reviewed publications for academics, which will keep them happy. It will also get the general public involved. And I'm not quite sure how to do this yet, but I think if this starts happening, then it will snowball and it will become much more interesting to everyone concerned. Okay. So here are some of my thoughts on this. I think that we need to make this interesting and fun to people. So, for example, you could design games that people can log on to and play, and what they're actually doing at the same time is doing some kind of scientific discovery process. So one idea, I think again, is put across in one of Greg Egan's books, is this idea of an autoverse, which is a simulated environment where you can play with sticks and balls, and it simulates atoms, for example. And the idea is that anyone can log on to this and play, but what you find happening is people start creating interesting structures, and they can use those structures to simulate large-scale systems like DNA and all kinds of things. So that's just one example of a way you could make this fun and make it into something people want to do. And of course use the full power of Web 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever we're up to now to get this across. So I mention here BOINC, which is the Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Network Computing. You might have heard of this in terms of SETI at home. which is the biggest one that's there. But BOINC is just a general framework for open source projects that allow people to use spare clock cycles on their computer to do some processing task, which gives you access to more computing power than all the supercomputers in the world if everyone runs this. So that's one way we could actually harness people's computing power. Again, I mentioned the scientific iPhone apps, so you can have iPhone apps that allow you to record data about your environment and send that back to some central server or location, like the bird watching and the tracking climate change. And then also large-scale open source learning. I think this is very important because I think you need to respect the general public in terms of learning, in terms of teaching them science. So we need to give them some way in which to make science interesting, because we have to respect them enough to know that they will find science interesting. And again, you can do this by using new ways of learning, so 2D and 3D visualizations, immersive environments, and kind of things like using Second Life as an environment to teach science, and all these kind of tools. And I think if we put in place these sort of things, we'll lose some of the stigma associated with scientists, which is that they're all kind of nerdy and spend all day standing at a blackboard doing complicated maths. I think that's the end. Yeah.
So you're enthusiastic about this future? You're not fearful about more people being involved in making science and technology run faster?
No, I don't think so, because I think that there'll always be harder problems for science, what we term science experts to work on. Yep. There's no end of those. So I just think that this power can be used to allow experts to redivert their attention.
A few quick questions, David.
Have you actually heard of Amazon's Mechanical Turk?
No.
Which is the commercialisation of this. It's basically, if you're a company and you want 1,000 people to have a look at your order system or something, you can actually put online, basically, and then people can go in, download, and get a small amount back. It's kind of the commercialised version of doing it for free.
Yeah, okay.
But again, they accept tasks from anybody, so it's one way of doing it. 20 people.
Question over here?
Yeah, if you're involving the public, then how can you trust the results that they submit, that they're accurate, that they've been done properly?
Yeah, okay.
That's true of graduate students too, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah,
Can't trust graduate students either.
So this comes down to how you design the framework for doing this. So for example, in the Galaxy Zoo, the people had a very short training session which allowed them to classify whether a galaxy was a spiral galaxy or something else. And it was actually quite easy to do once you had that training. So I think you need to make the problems something that the general public would be able to.
And wasn't there also some cross-checking, so that it was only the classifications only accepted if independent members of the public consistently give it the same?
Yes, so again you can use what's known as the wisdom of crowds to have an averaging effect as well, because you've got so many crowds that you can have redundancy in that and cross-check results quite easily.
Wouldn't one of the basic preconditions for any of this to work, which is getting your social networking media to effectively cross-fertilise with the high-trust society, that the current sort of models of funding that we have within science should be rendered transparent, so that both scientists and the public can see quite clearly what is funded or why it is not funded and why it has been refused. Until such time that occurs, all of this will remain just a few pioneer projects because they're not harnessing the full effect.
I agree with your points about funding. I mean, I think the funding scheme in science and in academia is actually more transparent than a lot of funding schemes. So, for example, you can go to EPSOT's website and you can look at all the projects that are being funded in the UK, and you can look who's on them and how much money they've got. So, I mean, I think that's a fairly transparent system.
And to my mind, it would be more that the professional would be able to see why the submission given, and then the research council saying quite clearly, we are not funding this, and giving reasons why. Because it's a high trust society, because it's science itself is to a certain extent open source, you need to have that information in the open, which then allows you to see whether a profession is open to discussion and capture, or what the actual
so maybe one thing you could make public would be would be the results of referees'
Yes.
statements on whether
Yes.
projects got funded or
Yeah,
not.
I think.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question then we'll Ben.
This is great, it's very interesting.